Hello, Professor Wills here, continuing with our examination of the art history of the Egyptian New Kingdom for our survey class. Well, as I promised, the New Kingdom was an era known for its grand building projects, and they weren't necessarily all dedicated to the pharaohs and their legacy, but sometimes they were built in to honor the plethora of Egyptian gods and goddesses. So what you find in the New Kingdom era are these monumental, sprawling, multi-acre temples. And we're going to examine one that actually had over 30 pharaohs contribute some aspect to this temple complex. It was considered one of the most sacred locations to the ancient Egyptians. So without keeping you in suspense any longer, let's move on to our PowerPoint and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, very good. So what we're looking at is, and I'll make myself disappear here for just a minute, an aerial view of the Temple of Amun-Re. Sometimes it's called the Temple at Karnak because it is located at Karnak in Egypt. It was begun in the 15th century, but it wasn't something that was built in just a brief period of time. It had a additive, cumulative evolution, as I mentioned, multiple pharaohs contributing some aspect to this very sacred location. Of course, Amun-Re, the sun god, it was the supreme god in the pantheon of Egyptian mythology, and so that explains the dedication to this particular location that you can see in this beautiful, perhaps late afternoon light on this slide here. What I'm going to show you now is an artist's rendering of what it likely looked at in its original state. So if I'll advance my slide here, this is what they think it might have looked like originally. So what you find here is it has two central axes, approaches this way and then perpendicularly this way into the main kind of temple areas of worship and reverence and other functions for the high priests and pharaohs who were only exclusively allowed at the Temple of Amun-Re. It was not for the average Egyptian to worship at. In fact, it was surrounded by a massive wall. Not surprisingly, we've seen that a lot with ancient Egyptian sacred locations. The wall 40 feet high and they say as thick as 26 feet. So again, it was a sacred location but only meant for the higher ups, the high priests and pharaohs of Egypt. It looks a lot like a resort though. It kind of reminds you, if you've ever been to Orange County, to the Tustin Marketplace, it has its whole shopping center layout in the style of the temple at Karnak, believe it or not. But it is resort-esque in this giant pool of water. It looks like some kind of fabulous swimming pool, but not at all. It was a pool of water that was meant to remind those visiting of what the Egyptians believed in their origin story of the primeval waters of their creation. They actually believed that a pyramid-shaped object kind of emerged out of those waters, and that is how the story of Egypt began. So that is what the waters there are for. On the approach into the sanctuary, you see these kind of flat-topped but slope-sided elements here. Those are called pylon temples, and I don't mean like Caltrans road pylons, but they certainly have that kind of, share that slope side to them, and through the series of these pylon temples you would access the sanctuary. Now what we're going to do is focus what's beneath the roof of this place, and it's here we're going to see something quite extraordinary and monumental. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I don't want to tease you with that, but I was going to have some fun with you with that. I'll come back later. This is another view of the ruins of the temple at Karnak. And we've already met, of course, Hatshepsut's famous mortuary temple, also built during the New Kingdom era as another example of this passion for monumental temple building in the New Kingdom era. All right, so as promised, beneath the roof of the temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, you can find an enclosed space called the Hyperstyle Hall. This is an artist's rendering of what they think it looked like originally. They've included a little human here, an Egyptian, to give you a sense of scale of these. What's remarkable about it are these soaring columns that you find supporting the roof of this sanctuary. And again, we're looking at the years circa 1290 to 1224 BCE in Karnak, Egypt, part of the monumental temple building programs that took place in the New Kingdom era. So these are massive. They are 40 feet in height. So the tallest columns in the center soared to a good 40 feet, or I beg your pardon, soared to 75 feet in height. And then their tops, these are the column capitals. You might remember that term, kind of like a cap on your head. It is the top of a column, the capital, whose diameter is a good 22 feet across. So you can just imagine the enormity of these columns. There are a multitude of these, some 134 of these, supporting this massive space, and originally painted, as you could see in this artist's rendering, as much of Egyptian sculpture and sculpture relief was painted originally. What you also see, some of the motifs painted on this example, is a reference to the lotus flower. We've talked about the lotus flower, the papyrus plant, being plants that grow along the Nile River in Egypt, but also hugely symbolic of both upper and lower Egypt. Moving on here, I wanted to show you a modern photograph of the massive columns with their reliefs. Now, there's a very specific technique of sculptural relief that you find on these hypostyle columns called a sunken relief. So the sunken relief, I'll come back to you, hello, is reminiscent when you might have gotten your, as a child, a gift of Play-Doh, and you roll out the clay, and then it's fun to kind of poke different objects and make impressions in that clay. That's very much like what you find with sunken relief. So if I were to show you another slide here, a little bit closer, you can see what I'm talking about, these kind of indentations. The goal is to preserve the contour lines of these massive columns. If it was more traditional low or high relief, it would read, the edges of the columns would read lumpy bumpy, right? It would ruin that consistent contour line that you see in these photographs. So sunken relief is the technique you find in New Kingdom Egypt to describe the details, the hieroglyphics and figurative art that you find continue to be organized in registers and bands along the length of these massive columns, with plenty of hierarchy of scale, of course, for emphasis, as well as the continued love affair with among the Egyptians with the composite view. That, of course, began way back in the Stone Age, didn't it? All right, another thing you find at the Hyperstyle Hall is another invention of the New Kingdom Egyptians, and that's something called the clear story. You can see that term right here. Looking up at this fenestrated grill, this is part of the clear story level. A clear story is a way to create an elevation that lets light, and in this case ventilation as well, into an otherwise purely inky dark space that could only be illuminated by maybe torches, maybe burning oil lamps. This is one of the first early examples of a window. They weren't using glass yet, but it was something that allowed them to create a window-like space. So if I take you back to the original artist's rendering, this explains the reason for the larger central columns. They create a kind of a pop-out or a pop-up of that part of the Hyperstyle Hall, and here's where the grills would be, creating this opportunity for the fenestration, which would be sculpted in stone, but allowed light and air to penetrate that sanctuary space. So, sunken relief, clear stories, these are contributions of the New Kingdom Egyptians seen at the temple at Karnak. So, if you want to see a fun movie shot there, rent sometime the James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. There's a good scene where he's trying to escape the bad guys with his beauty on his arm, shot at the actual location at the Temple of Karnak. It's a kick. All right. Thanks for joining me for today's mini lecture. I almost forgot. I have a couple of trivia photos for you. As promised, I like to show this to my classes connected to our ancient Egyptian unit. Do you recognize where we are in the upper left photo? That's right, Las Vegas. So there's another temple complex. There's Karnak, but there's another temple called Luxor, and that's the idea behind the Luxor Resort in Las Vegas that combines things from the Old Kingdom era that don't make sense, right? Like pyramids and the Great Sphinx. But hey, Vegas is all about, suspended disbelief, as they say in literature. Down below on the right, you can find a very modern glass pyramid on a particular campus. Some of you might be transferring there in the fall. Anybody know? That's Cal State Long Beach. That's their sports complex. So pyramids within easy driving distance from Los Angeles County for you to check out. The legacy of the ancient world continues into our era.